this event. All right. So, welcome everybody to um, uh, this closing roundtable in the Race and Policing in the Americas seminar series. My name's Patrick Deere. I'm co-organizer uh, um, at of the NYU Cultures of War and the Post-War Research Group. We're super excited to welcome a really wonderful panel of scholars, researchers, scholar activists uh, for a closing roundtable in which our panelists, who I'll introduce in a minute, are going to talk a bit about their current research and, as the description of the panel suggested, talk about their sense of questions about race policing, mass incarceration, and prison abolitionism, specifically in the United States. But I mean, this is a remarkable group of scholars who have also done work on transnational questions of race and policing, prison abolitionism, the carceral system, in and also in practical work in prison education as well. Um, so we're offering today's event in conjunction with the Center for the Americas at Queen's University in Belfast and the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. And as I mentioned, this is the closing event in a seminar series that has featured a session on the case of the US South, principally after the Jim Crow era, post World War II. A wonderful keynote from Nikhil Singh at Indiana University, talking about the foster care system, the Department of Child Services, and its relationships to the carceral system um, in and around in Illinois. We had a remarkable panel on perspectives on police violence in Brazil, and we're super excited. And a really brilliant session on crime fiction, policing, and racial injustice, which was moderated by our co-organizer, Andrew Pepper, really fantastically. And here we are at our closing roundtable. We have actually recorded all of these events, and you can find links to YouTube videos. We're also recording this event on both the Center for the Americas at Queen's University Belfast website, and also the Cultures of War and the Post-War website, if you want to take a look at those. But let me move now to our closing roundtable. And it's, as I mentioned, really exciting to have a really extraordinary group of scholars here today. I will introduce them. I think probably the way to go is to introduce them, our presenters. I'll introduce them from the outset, and then they will be presenting for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll invite our presenters to discuss and respond to each other in conversation, and to we'll have the opportunity for Q&A through the webinar Q&A box, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. Our first panelist is Sonia Das, who is Associate Professor of Linguistic Anthropology at NYU, where I teach as well. Sonia is co-editor-in-chief of the flagship journal of Linguistic Anthropology. She's the author of Linguistic Rivalries, Tamil Migrants and Anglo-Franco Conflicts from Oxford University Press, 2016, which is a study of the migration and diasporic experiences of Tamil-speaking Indians and Sri Lankans since the 1840s. Sonia's current research examines how the big data of body-worn camera and predictive policing perpetuates racial inequalities in US law enforcement. Our second presenter will be Gabriella Johnson, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of English at NYU, and I can attest both to Gabriella's brilliance as a scholar and a teacher in the English department. Gabriella's research and teaching focuses on African American literature, Black feminist theories, and prison abolitionist thought. She's currently writing her dissertation on 20th century African American women's fiction as a prison abolitionist imagination. Our third presenter is going to be Stuart Schrader, who is Associate Research Professor in the Center for Africana Studies and the Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins University. Stuart's the author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, from University of California Press in 2019. His book looks at the relationship between US projections of power overseas and the rise of the carceral state at home. And Stuart's going to talk to us, I think, maybe about his new project examining the political activities of police in the US since the 1960s via professional organizations and unions. And then our final presenter and respondent is going to be Nikhil Singh, who is, I'm also delighted to have as a colleague at NYU. Nikhil is Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History and the Faculty Director of NYU's Prison Education Program. Nikhil is a historian of race, empire, and culture in the 20th century US, and the author of Race and America's Long War from University of California Press, 2017, and the award-winning Black is a Country, Race and the Unfinished Struggle for Democracy from Harvard University Press, 2004. And Nikhil's working on a new book, which I'm really looking forward to, called Exceptional Empire, Race Colonialism and the Origins of US Globalism, which is also forthcoming from Harvard University Press. So now we've got the introductions out of the way. I'm really excited to go to our first presenter, Sonia Das. Sonia, over to you, and welcome.
Thank you, Patrick. So hello, everyone. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, as Patrick said, and I study police-civilian interactions in the US South. My research looks at how police officers interpret acts of escalation and de-escalation in speech, gesture, and movement in routine traffic stops. I also evaluate the pros and cons of body cams and dash cams by investigating how video surveillance footage shapes the perception of escalation and the legal standing of evidence presented in court trials. So for this project, I have access to an undisclosed corpus of body cam and dash cam footage of traffic stops that took place between 2014 and 2020 in Richland County, South Carolina. I also have interview data with criminal defendants, lawyers, judges, and clerks that I have personally collected, and ethnographic data of ride-alongs with police patrols and training sessions at the South Carolina Justice Academy. In today's presentation, I will argue that multimodal transcripts of police-civilian interactions can help criminal defendants expose the overstepping of police authority, bias in arrests, and other forms of discrimination by overcoming the optics of video surveillance that depict gesture and movement in racialized ways. Specifically, I will assert that transcripts are especially important as evidence to demonstrate when defendants' First Amendment rights are being challenged by police discretion. That is, when police officers regard acts of free speech as escalation instead. Whereas white Americans can exercise their First Amendment right to critique the police without fear of being read as escalating an interaction, when Black, brown, and Indigenous civilians insult a police officer or object to their arrest, these actions are often glossed as escalation to justify the excessive use of force as a tactical defensive response. Surveillance videos, body-worn camera footage, and reality television, through their technologically mediated images and sounds of racialized persons, can further depict them as erratic and suspicious, over-emotional and irrational, and potentially escalating into violence. If it is indeed true that an unequal burden is placed upon asymmetrically positioned and raced interlocutors to maintain peace, and if this asymmetry is responsible for the escalation of police force, then one can ask the following questions. One, how does the argument of escalation get deployed to incite and condone incidences of racial injustice by upholding the interactional norms, institutions, and ideologies of a racial caste system? Two, what role does video surveillance play in challenging or reinforcing these racial inequalities through their depictions of criminal defendants' embodied practices as escalation? In my presentation, I start by explaining how the theoretical framework of pragmatics and metapragmatics can be applied to the study of escalation, and then provide examples from my ethnographic and linguistic research to demonstrate how police discretion authorizes claims about escalation that deny Black, brown, and Indigenous civilians their constitutional rights. The concept of escalation, defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as an increase or development by successive stages, purports that acts of interpersonal conflict will scale up in affective charge to engender violence and achieve the mass destruction of life and property. In the context of the US, the invocation of escalation by police or military when identifying a perceived threat can translate into the denial or suspension of First Amendment rights. For example, Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, 1942, and Watts versus United States, 1969, established that exceptions to free speech protections include so-called fighting words or true threats, defined as face-to-face speech intended to cause psychic harm or act as a precursor to physical harm. Given the potential for civil rights injustices to ensue from using the true threats doctrine in policing contexts, the lack of critical engagements with escalation is surprising. Heeding the call to attend to power and the pragmatics of scale, and examine how some positions and perspectives are privileged at the expense of others as scales are institutionalized, I problematize efforts to provide a precise definition of the scalar metaphor of escalation as reproducing the reifying effects of state power and racial violence. Instead, I advocate for the discourse analysis of transcribed interactions between civilians and police to identify the disparities of power informing multiple discourses about escalation. To the police officer, signs of escalation index incremental changes in speech, gesture, and movement that signal the unfolding of a conflictual encounter and the rejection of police authority, including physical flight or attempts to flee. Although the racial biases in police discourses may not be apparent, the discourse analysis of multimodal transcripts can help to identify the pragmatic entailments of the circulation of stereotypes of racialized persona. My research uncovers that the social persona available to Black, Indigenous, and Brown civilians in their encounters with the police are limited to that of the potential fugitive seen on the verge of escalation, and that of a docile or reformed subject who instead acts concertedly to de-escalate. White Americans by default are generally presumed to be non-escalating actors. Hence, the underlying language ideology of escalation authorizes those in power to view and interpret the communicative practices of Black, Indigenous, and Brown civilians as threats that need to be curtailed, sometimes with excessive force, before conflict inevitably scales up to violence. Black, Indigenous, and Brown civilians bear the brunt of the blame for violence when the framework of escalation is enacted, even when video surveillance through body cams and dash cams is intended to protect their constitutional rights and ensure fair treatment. Although the impact of body cams and dash cams in reducing conviction rates in DUI cases and other traffic stops is promising from the point of view of racial justice, legacies of slavery and genocide nonetheless continue to inform the military, police, entertainment, industrial complex that transforms video surveillance into potentially harmful technologies. These racializing optics reaffirm the assumption that visual and oral communicative signs captured on video are perceptible and legally consequential evidence of escalation, even if such tokens cannot be measured. An ideology rooted in the racial optics of escalation furthermore erases how video footage taken from law enforcement contexts produces enduring cultural images of criminality and danger associated with the figure of the Black fugitive, a historical reference to a fleeing subject that draws on both liberatory and repressive narratives describing Black mobility and mobilization. Black Lives Matter protests have advanced the argument that images of Black fugitives, whether from body cam footage, facial recognition technology, or reality television shows, have saturated viewing publics and desensitized white aligned Americans to the racial injustices enacted daily onto minority communities. A white supremacist view of Black fugitivity therefore institutionalizes a racial optics that condones excessive force against Black, Brown, and Indigenous civilians in the name of escalation. My interviews with former criminal defendants of traffic stops reveal that Black and Brown people display a heightened sensitivity to the racializing optics of escalation in police encounters. When asked what they would teach a younger version of themselves about how to speak with police officers, one interviewee, a young Black man, explains his approach. He says, "Don't be an aggressor, keep your composure at all time, because they will try and do things to just say stuff like boy and stuff like that, just try and get you like off your toes to like get a negative reaction, whether it's a facial expression, whatever. It is like they want to be caught slipping. So please be on your P's and Q's at all times, like continue to give off positive energy, just try and do that at all times." This and other interviews highlight a meta-pragmatic awareness that questioning the legal knowledge of police officers functions as a trigger that can lead to accusations of escalation, evoking images of aggressive behavior falling outside of white supremacist norms. Additionally, children are socialized to preemptively identify acts of police provocation to escalation as rooted in colonial histories, and to keep their facial expressions and movements neutral in spite of these provocations. In this example, calling a Black man boy betrays a white supremacist view of Black men as wards of the state and is both legally and popularly recognized as a racial slur. Media industries that produce and capitalize on images of Black fugitives also presume criminality in acts or projections of refusal or fleeing, and ingrain into national consciousness racist stereotypes of violent Black communities targeted for surveillance and entertainment value. For example, one entertainment cop show, Live PD, which was canceled in June 2020 in response to nationwide Black Lives Matter protests, caricatures the fraught nature of police-civilian encounters by suggesting that conflict and interaction is instigated by criminal suspects. One young Black man says to me, quote, "You gotta always watch out for Live PD, and like, you ain't gotta be doing nothing. It's like, you just watch out," end quote. Even his mother stays at home on Fridays when Live PD films their live show. He tells me he believes that police officers exaggerated his own offense for television ratings because a live PD crew was present at his stop. So he said, yeah, he was just like, because I had like money on the seats and stuff, and he was just trying to make it seem like I was a big drug dealer. Like, and as I didn't know what he was doing until I got home, seeing the actual footage, like it was only $57 and a lot of ones. And he was trying to make it seem like I had just made a drug deal or something. Like I was like, they had just made this look real bad. Yeah, like y'all just made this look real good for y'all cameras. One final example illustrates the importance that multimodal transcripts of body cam and dash cam videos can play in exposing the racializing optics that are entangled with white supremacist notions of Black fugitivity. During a routine traffic stop captured on dash cam and body cam, the arresting officer pulls over a moving vehicle with missing tag lights, expressing suspicion about an elderly white man driving in a car with two young Black men. After another officer finds 2 rocks of crack cocaine wedged on the passenger side windowsill, he accuses the young Black man seated in the passenger seat of trying to inconspicuously flick the drugs off the sill, even though this alleged action is not captured on video, and the elderly white man insists that the crack belongs to him and he had asked the passenger to get rid of it for him. Responding with anger and frustration at the accusation, the young Black man in the passenger seat steps outside of the car and starts pacing back and forth, questioning the arresting officer's legal knowledge. The officer responds forcefully, treating both actions as escalation, whereas he is sympathetic to another young Black man who remains silent and stands still. Policing actions associated with the 2 young Black men are differently entailed to racialized voicing contrasts, with the one in the passenger seat being interpreted through the persona of the fugitive and referred to by a police officer as, quote, that one keeps wandering. From his facial grimaces and eye rolling to his use of negative repetition, the absence of honorific address terms, and the annoyance and frustration evident in his speech, the young Black man's demeanor prompts the narcotics officer to conclude he needs to go. The other young Black man, who had sat in the back seat, instead manages his self-presentation through signs interpreted as non-threatening, using honorific address terms such as sir, making short stride movements, and using poetic repetition to align himself with the syntax of the police officers. Referred to as, quote, the young one by the arresting officer, he successfully performs the social persona of a reformed convict recently released from jail and committed to staying out of trouble, and is released. In contrast, the officers arrest and charge the elderly white man who confesses and the young Black man in the passenger seat who denies the charge, both with possession of crack cocaine. To conclude, my analysis of both interview and corpus data suggests that certain communicative signs, especially frenetic movement such as pacing, and the verbal questioning of police officers' knowledge of the law are treated pragmatically as escalation and trigger police responses such as de-escalation tactics or arrests. Second, there's widespread metapragmatic awareness of the limits of free speech among Black, Brown, and Indigenous civilians who understand that police discretion and video surveillance often work together to deny them their constitutional rights. Multimodal transcripts also show when stereotypes underlying the persona of the fugitive, understood historically as both repudiating and fleeing from white supremacist institutions and actors, come to play in seemingly routine encounters that can escalate and which lead police officers to use their discretion to deny the First Amendment rights of racial minorities. The analysis of multimodal transcripts thus aims to correct the biases of police reports and video footage by contextualizing the movement and gestures of participants within a longer interdiscursive history of communication, one that pays critical attention to the legacies of slavery and genocide and how these continue to inform the enactments of a racial caste system. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sonia. And that was so fascinating and such urgent and important work that you're doing. Thank you. So I'm delighted to, and right on time as well, hence apologies for the alarm going off. I'm delighted to bring in our next presenter, Gabriella Johnson. Gabriella, over to you.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for the introduction and the invitation to participate. And thank you to Patrick and Andrew for helping make this panel possible today. So today I want to share a few ideas from the dissertation chapter I'm currently writing on Toni Morrison's 1970 novel, The Bluest Eye, as prison abolitionist theory. I'll first say a few words about the dissertation project as a whole, and then I'll share some observations and questions that working on this chapter has yielded for me so far. My dissertation proposes that African-American literature is ripe for the work of imagining alternatives to the carceral state. It examines how 20th and 21st century African-American women's novels engage and destabilize carceral logics, or those modes of thought that make prisons seem like common sense. Beyond simply documenting the racist nature of the US prison system, the novels I study enable prison abolitionist imagining through restaging the harm and punishment scenario. Specifically, they disappear carceral institutions from their characters' decision-making in the face of harm, which I read as a gesture toward non-carceral modes of redress. In my current chapter, I make the argument that The Bluest Eye is a carceral novel. The prison hardly appears, and yet there are prisons everywhere. Morrison's novel is particularly interesting as a carceral work because it does not use the prison as a setting, nor dramatize the individual's struggle against the carceral state. I approach the novel as a work of confinement literature precisely because it sidesteps these conventional expectations of the genre. Such a reading then both expands the generic scope of confinement literature and it places the novel within prison abolitionist discourse. Rather than set the story in and near prisons, the novel renders domestic and psychological spaces in carceral terms. Carceral spaces are imagined in these surprising ways in the novel because of its focalization through Black women and girls. The novel affords an occasion for prison abolitionist theorizing because it depicts the rape of Pecola Breedlove, a young Black girl, without answering that harm with the imprisonment of her assailant, her father, Charlie. The novel's lack of courts and prisons offers a way to think about the trouble of raping Black girls without enlisting the carceral state. Approaching Morrison's novel as a work of confinement literature also foregrounds an interrogation of the collusion of male violence and carceral violence in restricting Black women's lives. I noticed that the novel portrays molestation, rape, battery, and incarceration as existing within a web of oppression rather than as occupying a problem and solution logic. Crucially, I argue that the novel renders rape itself as a form of incarceration. These violences are dual concerns for Black feminists, and dealing with them together in this novel helps to inflect prison abolitionist work with a Black feminist perspective. Now I want to turn more directly to the novel to demonstrate how carcerality appears in the absence of the literal prison, and then I'll close with the question of innocence. Rendering domestic space as carceral space and rape as a form of incarceration are two ways that the novel's Black feminist framework contributes to prison abolitionist discourse. The domestic is a site of imprisonment and a site of abolitionist possibility. This suggests that another site of engagement for prison abolitionist work has to be what we think of as home or what we think of as family. To illustrate this idea, I want to look at the narrator's description of the Breedlove's residence. Morrison writes, quote, "There is an abandoned store on the southeast corner of Broadway and 35th Street in Lorain, Ohio. It does not recede into its background of leaden sky, nor harmonize with the gray frame houses and Black telephone poles around it. Rather, it foists itself on the eye of the passerby in a manner that is both irritating and melancholy. Visitors who drive to this tiny town wonder why it has not been torn down, while pedestrians, who are residents of the neighborhood, simply look away when they pass it," end quote. That the Breedloves live in an abandoned store rather than a house situates their domestic space as already lacking domesticity. The familial harmony, privacy, and warmth associated with home is obliterated by the market relations of a storefront. That they live in a store suggests that property relations mutilate the family relation, as scholars have argued, or that there is no family relation at all. The lack of house and home suggests an alternate relationship configuration than the family and all of its attendant assumptions of love, care, and protection. The word abandoned alludes to the abandonment issues that plague each of the Breedloves. Pauline Breedlove never felt like she belonged in her family for lack of a nickname and stories told about her childhood. Charlie was left on a trash heap by his mother and abandoned twice by his father. Their son, Sammy, seems to have no tether to the family as he repeatedly runs away, abandoning them. And of course, Pecola is the loneliest girl in Lorraine, who's never received love from any source. That the place is called abandoned, even though people currently live there, implies that the Breedloves are non-entities in their community. Additionally, the state of the place as abandoned could refer to its lack of upkeep, as well as to the abandonment of the Breedloves by the community. The neighbors simply look away. This description renders the residence like a prison in the out of sight, out of mind logic that enables the continuation of carceral violence. That the abandoned store does not recede into its background of leaden sky suggests that it is discordant with nature. At the same time, their residence neither fits with the built environment. It does not harmonize with the gray frame houses and black telephone poles that surround it. Sticking out from both the natural and man-made landscapes, the Breedloves' dwelling does not belong to either category of space. It is wholly separate, outcast. In this way, it can be either a space of absolute negation or a space of alternate possibility. The Breedloves' residence is a carceral space. It is a space of confinement rife with violence from which Pecola cannot escape. Unlike her brother who runs away, quote, Pecola, on the other hand, restricted by youth and sex, experimented with methods of endurance, end quote. Between the two Breedlove children, the novel draws Pecola as more confined precisely because she is a young girl. A prisoner in her own home, Pecola is also made into a prisoner in others' domestic spaces. When her classmate traps her in a room in his house, for example, he tells her point blank, quote, you can't get out, you're my prisoner, end quote. Further, it is in the kitchen, the ostensible center of feminine space, where she is raped by her own father. In the narration of both these scenes, Pecola makes but one sound, quote, a hollow suck of air in the back of her throat, end quote. This identical reaction parallels the experiences of being made a prisoner and being raped in the novel. That Pecola's mother then beats her, either for being raped or for being pregnant, is unclear. This act again links rape and punishment in Pecola's experience of confinement in the novel. In addition to Pecola, a character who helps us to rethink the subject of confinement literature, Charlie, her father, is a critical character for my analysis. He is a perpetrator of harm. He is a Black male character represented in a negative light from the perspective of critics who see African-American cultural production as a means of combating stereotypes. He is an unemployed alcoholic who beats his wife and rapes his daughter. The fixation on punishing Morrison for daring to present such an unrespectable character, for seeming to risk confirming racial stereotypes, is misguided and uninteresting. More interesting is the compassion the narrator shows Charlie in light of the worst things he's ever done. Focusing on the ways that he seems to play his role in the myth of the insatiable Black rapist causes readers to ignore the ways that the novel extends him grace, context, and love. From a prison abolitionist perspective, his list of crimes is almost beside the point. I argue that the novel's inclusion of a Black male character who commits harms does not equate to an endorsement of their real-life criminalization and incarceration. Rather, it is through the narrative disarticulation between harm and punishment, i.e. Charlie is not in prison for raping Pecola, and the narrative siding with the criminal, that the novel participates in a prison abolitionist imagination. At the beginning of the novel, the narrator, Claudia, tells this entire story in short form. She begins, quote, quiet as it's kept, there were no marigolds in the fall of 1941. We thought at the time that it was because Pecola was having her father's baby that the marigolds did not grow, end quote. Claudia is a child during the novel's narrative present, but here she is an adult giving a retrospective on that year. And in her retrospective, she also offers the following, quote, "Our innocence and faith were no more productive than his lust or despair. Charlie Breedlove is dead, our innocence too," end quote. Claudia seems to be making a kind of equation between herself and the other young girls, her sister and Pecola, and Charlie, both in the parallel phrasing and in the fact that neither group's traits were more productive than the other. I'm curious about the use of the word innocence here. It could be read as a type of childhood ignorance, but this reading doesn't find much support in the novel, given that the girls were always seeking knowledge, listening in on grown folks' conversations, and they were intimately aware of the men in town who liked to touch young girls. If not a reference to a type of childlike unknowing, I read the word innocence as a strategy, an effort to not do wrong things in order to keep safe from harm. That their innocence was no more productive then suggests that it didn't have the force to make a difference in their material world. It could not prevent the terrible. A strategy of innocence is its own cage. It cannot produce safety for Black people living in a community traumatized by racism. In light of this discussion, I'm left questioning whether the novel is theorizing an irrelevance of the terms innocence and guilt altogether. The novel seems to oppose the strategy of representing Black people as innocent as an argument for our freedom from violence. So The Bluest Eye is a carceral novel that, because of its Black feminist framework, expands the generic scope of confinement literature and contributes to prison abolitionist discourse. It extends the sites of engagement for prison abolitionist work to include not only confrontations with the state, but also our confrontations with each other at home and in family. Lastly, it calls our attention to re-theorize the terms of innocence and guilt outside of legal common sense and perhaps dispense with them altogether. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gabriella. That was brilliant. And I love that closing observation of yours about the way that the novel and your own work is extending the sites of engagement, and it's absolutely what we're aiming to do in today's roundtable. So thanks so much, that was great. And I'm delighted to move on now to Stuart Schrader. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really grateful to be here. And thanks also to the organizers and co-panelists and everybody who's tuned in. So I want to use a story that came out over the weekend to reflect on what we are talking about when we talk about police. The story was published by Vice. It was written by a reporter who covers policing quite well, named Trone Dowd, if I'm saying that correctly. He's drawing from an LA Times article, so I'm just going to read this to you. 2 Los Angeles Police Department officers just caused an international incident by making a wrongful arrest in France. It happened in Marseille, where LAPD Chief Michael Moore and Assistant Chief Robert Marino were walking the streets after dinner with their wives, along with 2 LAPD officers as security detail. On November 17th, around 11 p.m. local time, Moore, Marino, their wives, the security detail, and members of the French National Police left a restaurant, according to police. A man walking down the street with a group bumped into Marino's wife, who then accused him of stealing her cell phone. The security team chased after the man and arrested him. But they and the local authorities quickly realized the man hadn't taken a thing from the commander's wife, according to French police. And now the department is opening an investigation into the wrongful stop, which took place more than 5,700 miles outside their jurisdiction, the LA Times reported. The incident prompted an internal investigation, and the names of the LAPD officers involved are being withheld. Moore and Marino were in France as part of a week-long trip that had been organized so the top cops could meet with French law enforcement officials to discuss security plans for both the 2024 Summer Olympic Games in France and the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles. The arrest led the man who was detained and others who were walking with him to file a complaint with the French authorities. Those complaints were then reported to the US consulate. Moore called the debacle an unfortunate incident and apologized to local officials in Marseille for the stop. Police officials Police officers don't generally have the authority to make arrests outside their own jurisdiction, let alone in other countries. Quote, when law enforcement officers leave the country, they don't have any authority even in other states, unquote. Brian Higgins, a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York, told Vice News, quote, they were outside their jurisdiction, they don't have authority, and they were completely wrong, unquote. Higgins said the encounter could have become an international incident. Quote, I would have been a lot more sure of the allegations before you made an action, quote, he said. Continuing the quote, even if it was in the US, you should have been more sure. But to do it when you're in another country during what we can call diplomatic efforts, it's obviously embarrassing, unquote. The LAPD did not immediately respond to Vice News's requests for comment. End of story. Now, the LA Times story has a few additional details about whether private funds paid for the junket or public funds. This ultimately might be what gets these guys in trouble. Maybe they misappropriated funds. At least they're probably gonna have to file some, post facto amendments to their forms and all of that sort of thing. But we don't really know who these officers are because their union contract of sovereign impunity and anonymity apparently travels with them overseas into another sovereign territory, even if their authorization to effect the arrest does not. But, contrary to the article, actually, they didn't arrest anyone. They just manhandled and stopped and frisked this person, which requires in the US case, not probable cause, but reasonable suspicion, which is clearly translatable across the ocean because racism is reasonable suspicion transformed into a global system of ordering the social. Now, just to be clear, I didn't see in these two versions of the stories any indication of the identity of the person who was stopped and frisked. So I'll let your imaginations run wild, as did Marino's wife's imagination run wild while she walked the street in Marseille. Now, I'll also note one other detail that seems pertinent but wasn't included. The Olympics in 2024 will be in Paris. Paris and Marseille are quite far from each other. I looked at the map to confirm this. And from the Olympics official website, as far as I could tell, nothing pertaining to the Olympics is happening in Marseille, a port city, a city that has a crucial development in the history of the development of a global multiracial working class radicalism, but also a recent history of far-right Islamophobia. Now, Marseille's mayor, as far as I can tell, he's a socialist by his party's name, but that kind of means he's a Reagan Democrat, as far as I can tell. There was a regional election in 2021, which saw gains by the far-right Republican Party, the French Republican Party. I'm no expert on French politics, but I do think these scales of politics matter as we compare Marseille to Los Angeles, which these cops themselves were surely doing. Another detail I discovered, there's this ongoing tour of France, flag bearers for the Olympics. They're trying to generate interest in the Olympics. They're touring the country. They visited Marseille about a month before this incident. So the point is that this incident occurred almost certainly during an event that had no real bearing whatsoever on law enforcement nor the Olympics in Paris in 2024. So let me try to throw a few interpretive and analytical moves that I think we might want to make to understand this story, because I think it does actually a great job of illustrating key principles that we should adopt studying police, even as it kind of reads as a sort of absurdist tale of slapstick Keystone Cop type activity. But maybe this should be the encyclopedia entry on policing. Maybe we should be teaching it to students at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, in part because of the way it reveals the joke of police power, which is more like a ruse, which is that the police power far exceeds the uniform, the badge, the jurisdiction, but never the gun. So here are some of my elaborations. First, the police power is defined by discretionary limitlessness in terms of its objects. Anything that can be construed as a threat, or anyone who can be a person of interest, in the favored phrase of police today, can be policed regardless of the law. Another way to say this is that the law needs police, but police do not need law. And yet, how does one become a person of interest? The diagnostic criteria are also the prognostic criteria, which is to say what is unsaid in this article but implied. How does one become a person of interest? The answer is largely by race, meaning race is the index of interest to police. Police power is, as scholars like Marcus Dirk-Dubber have argued, defined by undefinability. That does not mean that it is defined by geographic limitlessness per se, because the police power is also is always spatially grounded, whether in the household of the patriarch, the neighborhood of the precinct house, the county jail of the sheriff's office, the border crossing post, and on and on. But in the US case, it has tended toward geographic limitlessness, toward the obliteration of jurisdiction. In my own work, I've explained how the discretionary limitlessness and defining undefinability of police has been leavened by and intersected with the globe-spanning empire of capital, whose thirst, of course, for labor power and raw materials is limitless. And it is and has been under the US, the stewardship of the US since the end of World War II, and where it has pivoted or waxed and waned in its focus and its geopolitical orientation toward or away from, Havana or Moscow or Hanoi or Baghdad or Kandahar. Those are all its lodestars, and it is this flexibility in spatial orientation that makes the police power of the US state global, what confers its status as global policeman. It makes the police institution so concordant with the project of US global hegemony. Thus, as I've written, global hegemony by the global policeman relies on global policemen, whom it details to train, equip, arm, and indoctrinate other native police into a mission, into a machine of stop and frisk on a global scale. What that means is that jurisdiction is not restraint on police power, but is actually a contingent, immutable project of the police institution, which is different from policing as an activity. And this is a key principle for us. The police institution is not the same thing as police, the activity. This is the point of so much of our theorizing about police, and yet the police institution is rapacious, like policing the activity. Police try to make one into the other. Police can't but try to make their own institutional architecture match policing's operational possibility, which is to say that if it is defined by undefinability and limitlessness, then it will constantly attempt to enact it. It will make its institution defined by the practical constraints of budget, personnel, jurisdiction, and law match the prospect of its unconstrained possibility. And the LAPD has been incredibly adept at this project going back decades. And in my book, I try to illustrate this point with reference to a mission by two Spanish-speaking LAPD officers who went to the Dominican Republic in 1962 to put down what they thought was a communist insurgency. Or we could look to Daryl Gates, who came up with a harebrained scheme in 1980 to free the hostages by sending the LAPD SWAT team, and on and on and on. So let us look again back at this story once more through the sort of lens I would propose, which is to say, analyzing police and capital accumulation as mirroring each other's limitlessness under the sign of the US state. So the empirical details about the Olympics. The Olympics are a world scale machine for dispossession and expropriation of the poor in the guise of security. We all know, of course, in Capital Volume 1, Chapter 28, Marx writes of the bloody legislation against the expropriated, which is the hallmark of the state role in the so-called primitive accumulation, which is the origin point of the motley multiracial proletariat, the global vagabonds who made Marseille a prominent way station for some time in the 19th and 20th century, a place of internationalism and solidarity, as Claude McKay has taught us. And Los Angeles invented this purpose of expropriation for the Olympics in 1984, and we'll reenact it again in the lead up to 2028, which is to say clearance, dispossession, the coercive administration of the class of poverty through criminalization. Now, I like to watch the Olympics as much as anyone, but let us remember that the Olympics comes into being like capital in Marx's correction of Augier in chapter 31, quote, dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt, unquote. But now Marx held in abeyance here in this 1860s analysis, his very detailed earlier analysis of the actual mechanisms of this process, which he wrote about for the Rheinische Zeitung in 1842 and 1843. It's depicted quite wonderfully in the opening scenes of the film The Young Karl Marx, where the German forest police brutalized the peasants gathering fallen branches. These were the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. And they, the horseback riding, club-wielding police, enforced the expropriation of the forest and the fens, and they therefore created the liberal property laws. Or in Neoclassicist terms, they fabricated a capitalist social order to replace customary law and the possibility of subsistence outside or in excess of the wage relation. And Marx's analysis of those liberal property laws and the German forest police actually got him chased by the police out of Germany and into exile. and maybe precipitated his break from Hegel, if you believe he broke from Hegel. So that clubbing of gatherers of wood is the very modern and nearby origin of the police institution as we know it, and is also the reason primitive accumulation is so called primitive, because it is that most modern state invention, the police institution, which sets into motion the limitless thirst of capital, which requires a limitless institutional protector that we call the police. And this centuries-old project will continue in nearly unchanged fashion as the houseless are swept from the streets of LA, in continuing the ongoing project of settler dispossession and genocide in the region. So the LAPD officers have traveled to Marseille to learn what a properly old Europe Islamophobic police project must entail, I assume. And we learn from a professor of criminology that nothing that criminology teaches us about the police power is actually correct. So let me ask you this to close. I mean, I'm inspired by my colleague, Nikhil Singh, who you'll hear from in just a moment. Do you think that if you are a fleeing felon in the legalistic term, and you cross a county or a state line in your car, or if you are on the screen of a drone operator and you cross from Iraq into Syria, you are suddenly going to escape? Does the police power run like Wile E. Coyote into the side of a cliff of jurisdiction, and you, the roadrunner, the fleeing felon, will get away? No, of course not. We all know this, because the police power ultimately is a patriarchal power of protecting what it understands as the unprotected, which is its wife, and which is its benefactor, which is capital on a global scale. And in the process, it makes what we think of as race, which is why we have the police in the first place. Thank you.
Wow, Stuart, thanks so much. Just a brilliant series, as you promised us, of interpretive and analytical moves from a new French Connection 3 featuring the LAPD top brass. Wonderful, thank you. Well, I'm delighted now to move to our final presenter, Nikhil Singh. Nikhil, over to you. Oh, sorry, you just need to unmute.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Andrew, for inviting me to participate. This looks like it's been a wonderful series, and I'm sure that I will be going back to look at some of this when I have some time and I catch my breath from the semester. And my fellow panelists, I also thank for the wonderful presentation so far. So I've been kind of debating what to say here. I have a piece that I've been working on for a while that is about what me and my co-author Tweelin Tu are calling the other cop in the George Floyd case. Of course, there are several other cops in the George Floyd case awaiting trial. One of them is a man named Tu Tao, who comes from Minneapolis's Hmong community, and who, if you see the video, which I must confess I've never watched, but I have seen interviews with Tao, and he was kind of put himself between the crowd and the policemen that were pinning Floyd down, including Chauvin, who is Tao's partner. So Tao was riding with Chauvin when they came on the scene, and parts of how they came on the scene are significant to the story. So I may have a few things to say about this. I have a long piece on this, and I hesitate to kind of go into an entirely kind of full presentation of this. But I think that instead what I'll do is I'll offer a few kind of broader reflections, and probably I'll bring Tao back in at the end. And I also will try, if I can, to make a couple of remarks that maybe will connect with the presentations, which I think are really, really rich, and each in their own right deserves a full discussion. So I guess I'll start with the phrase that comes from my colleague and comrade Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a quite important scholar of the prison and abolitionist thinker and public intellectual. And so Ruthie often says, capitalism requires inequality, racism enshrines it. And I wonder if we might add then also a third clause: policing ensures it. So capitalism requires inequality, racism enshrines it, policing ensures it. And my second kind of epigraph to the remarks, if you will, is a phrase that I've used in an essay I wrote called "The Whiteness of Police" a few years ago, and it comes from John Burgess, who's often thought to be the founding kind of figure in American political science. And Burgess wrote around 1900, maybe 1899, I think, in one of his kind of founding volumes on political thought, as it was called then. The police power is the counterpart to the realm of individual liberty. The police power is the counterpart to the realm of individual liberty. And I think that's a really interesting formulation, and one that's worth spending some time kind of thinking about what it means. So the way I approached this, sort of keeping both of these quotes in mind, was to think about how if we place policing within the discussion of capitalism and racism, as Stuart does in his work as well, then we might begin to kind of refine the notion that comes to us from Cheryl Harris, among other thinkers, of whiteness as property, as whiteness as a kind of status that accrues its value by a relationship to property, by a relationship to ownership, by access to material goods, but also by a defense of the status itself as a kind of commodified attribute of personhood. And one of the ways I wanted to refine the notion of whiteness as property by thinking about the whiteness of police, by thinking about how policing ensures something about, ensures the ways capitalism and racism work together and continue to work together, was to suggest that policing is a kind of intermediary status distinction and occupational location that works to extend and fortify, and in some sense also equalize, the government of public life in a world dominated by private property holders, whose possessions included other human beings and lands inhabited but unframed by claims of legal ownership. I mean, that's what we mean when we talk about slavery and genocide at the origins of the story. We actually mean something very specific. We mean the ways in which coercive power got employed to construct a realm of formal equality for some that was then actually subject to policing in relationship to another domain that was thought to exist outside of it, in a kind of uncivil sphere, or even a kind of anti-civilizational sphere, if you think of where native populations were imagined. So, there's often a kind of crude story that gets told of the line from the slave patrol, or the line from the frontier militia to the modern police force. And I think we should be wary of that. Just as I think we should be wary of a too simple story of kind of the inheritances of slavery and genocide. Right, but I think by the same token, it's a challenging question to try to think through the continuities in the relationship between racial ordering under capitalism and the specific role that policing plays within that. And we shouldn't presume that policing takes on an outsized importance only in the contemporary moment. Policing is there at the origin, right? So it goes through a number of different iterations and mutations. And so one of the questions that I have, and that I kind of bring to the subject, I guess, and have written on, is policing is, in a sense, always the policing of racial order, right? We see that from the beginning. But in what sense is policing itself a racializing project or a racializing institution? And these are different kinds of claims, because I think we sometimes confuse them or conflate them, that policing is racist because we live in a racist society. Yes, that seems to be true. And I think Sonia's paper shows that in some really interesting ways, the ways in which there's already a kind of structure, a set of understandings of how a kind of communicative rationality works in racial terms that then enters into the police encounter, right? But I'm also then interested in the work policing does to reconstitute the racial order, right? And I think again, Sonia's work shows that, as does Stuart's. So in remembering Burgess, we might say policing manages juridical consistency and administrative prerogative. It coordinates the proportion of open space to carceral space, and it balances the necessary use of force with the inherent riskiness of a society dependent on the consent of the governed. But in this way, policing is more than reflective of racial ordering, but reproductive of racial order. We might say policing is the tip of the spear of racialization within a society that defines rights in terms of self-ownership, the point where what Gilmore calls group differentiated vulnerability meets coercive, legal, and extra-legal violence. As Burgess's contemporary U.B. Phillips observed, all white people could exercise a police power over slaves. Policing, in this sense, comes to give a certain content to social citizenship itself. And it's notable that the obsession with policing runs through the Redeemer School. The Redeemer School, with a group of historians and political scientists in the early 20th century who are rethinking the kind of legacy of Reconstruction and trying to, in a sense, re-narrate the story of Reconstruction as a tragic failure, that Black enfranchisement was premature, that Black people were not ready or fit for self-government, and that racial segregation itself was a progressive, if not modernizing institution, and the police were central to that. So the Redeemers are really trying to kind of understand what modern police power is, and their very understanding of modern police power is deeply embedded in this set of historical reflections. In fact, in his book on the antebellum period, Burgess offers this very interesting aside in one chapter where he talks about how the perfection of police powers in the South before the Civil War could have prevented the Civil War. That instead of fighting against the fugitive slavery law at a nationwide scale, the South should have simply strengthened its own internal policing mechanism that would have prevented slaves from escaping. And in that sense, Burgess is really kind of, I think, way, way ahead of his time in imagining how the police can kind of operate in this sort of decentralized kind of capillary way to enforce racial despotism, even in a country or even in a kind of society that formally rejects racial inequality, right? So there's a kind of anticipatory understanding there of what the police might be able to do and what they might be good for. Of course, Burgess is also writing these reflections during the moment of the Philippine War, in which the US is going overseas, fighting its first counterinsurgency on a kind of overseas on a mass scale, and reflecting on the police power in the Philippines. Burgess comments that the way we should think about policing is that it's something like what he calls the dark continent of our jurisprudence, the convenient repository of everything of which our juristic categories can find no other place. And this goes again to kind of the comments that Stuart made and that Sonia made and that Gabriella made as well, that there's something about policing here that operates in this realm of the elastic, the perceptual, the discretionary, that is specifically associated with a kind of vector of power. Right, so that's why I sort of talk about it as the tip of the And that's why I think we struggle to really define what policing is, because it has this kind of formless quality. Indeed, again, another work from this period, this early period, probably the first book that uses the word police power in the title, Ernst Freund's book on the police power, published in 1904, Freund says, the police power is not a fixed quantity, but an expression of social, economic, and political conditions. As long as these conditions vary, the police power must be elastic, capable of development. And I was thinking of the resonances between elasticity and escalation, and how there's a kind of moment in policing where police have the power of decision, which is also the power of life and death. And I do wonder whether there is any way really to check that power. I think that's one of the reasons why we end up in a conversation about abolition when it comes to police, because police reform is so often kind of tied into and channeled into the strengthening of police power. In the Philippines at that moment, of course, the US is involved in a counterinsurgency, which Alfred McCoy, the historian, has described as a laboratory of police modernity. And in this sense, policing turns out not only to be elastic, but a mobile and strategic category, to use Anne Stoller's phrase, that enables a kind of reconciling of disparate racial and colonial conditions. And I think more than any other scholar, Stuart's work has really pointed us to this set of connections, that policing in the 20th century is internationalized, and it's internationalized through the circuitry of empire. Fast forward to the 1950s, my final example, actually my second to final example, we have Charles Sloane, who's a really interesting figure that for me, who is a small town police chief in upstate New York. And what Sloane just formalizes the connection in an article he writes in the early 1950s. He says, policing and counterinsurgency are two sides in what he calls a comparable battle for the existence of civilization, without which the world would descend into savagery and bestiality. So here you have, in the 1950s, this same kind of idea of policing as a kind of internally concentrated vector of expansionary force, one that is then field tested in the outer world that's seen as being kind of necessarily subject to this kind of disciplinary power. When Sloane wrote this phrase in an article on the history of the use of police dogs, which he himself traced back to the hunt for fugitive slaves. And then the next year, Sloane himself moves from being a police chief in Cortland, New York, to becoming one of the officials charged with setting up the police academy in South Vietnam for the United States government. So all these connections are there. We see them kind of embedded again and again. And just to begin my conclusion, one of the first things you see in the upstate prison, where I do a lot of work in prison education, is a small folded flag dedicated to the corrections officers who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, including in the notorious Abu Ghraib prison. You, of course, may remember that Derek Chauvin joined the Minneapolis police following the second of two four-year stints in the Army Reserve Police. And Tu Tao, the Hmong policeman awaiting trial, is part of a community in Minneapolis that narrates its own presence in Minneapolis back to the fighting of a counterinsurgency war in Southeast Asia, in which the Hmong themselves were unwillingly conscripted. To me, this is the more interesting line of argument for tracking the elective affinities and continuities of policing and race. The point isn't that there is a direct line between the beat of the slave patrol and the modern patrolman's beat, any more than it is the case that mass incarceration is simply the new Jim Crow, though it is understandable why these arguments became popular. Rather, the point is to understand how the specific technology of policing, particularly its elasticity and mediation of property and wagelessness, gets grafted onto technologies of racialization that similarly mediate the relation of capital and citizenship, the inner war and the outer war. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nikhil. I mean, that was just a really terrific way to give us a sense of the importance of your own work across multiple fields, and also I really appreciated the way you were responding to Sonia, Gabriella, and Stuart as well. So we thought that we could just give our panelists, and thanks so much again. I mean, we're in a webinar format, but I know that we would have heard very resounding and warm applause were we in person. I thought it'd be great, if you wanted to go around and respond to each other's presentations. I mean, one striking question that was raised, I think, in different ways across different registers was, Nikhil, you asked at the end, is there any way to check that power? I think we've had some, suggestions, but so Sonia, Gabriella, Stuart, maybe we can go in turn. If you just would like to respond or pick up on anything you've heard in the presentations, maybe that speaks to you, common themes or questions that you had. Sonia, over to you first.
All right, thank you. What wonderful presentations. Thanks to all of you. A lot of things to think about. One of the things that really resonated with me is this notion of the limitless, the lack of limitations, the elasticity of policing power. Nikhil, you talked about it as being on the tip of racialization, or a kind of vector of power. I'm just interested in the relationship in my own research, and I'm wondering if any of you can talk about this, the relationship between policing power and the way in which police are collecting and constructing evidence of criminality, and using, if we're thinking about policing as sort of at the intersection of capitalist and sort of capitalism and racism, how do we think about the ways in which evidence gets produced as a function of the discretionary powers of the police? That's something that came to mind. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Gabriella, if you have any responses or thoughts. It was really exciting to hear your own work as a, literary and cultural scholar, bringing this question of, narrative is a common feature across all of the presentations today. So, Gabriella, any reflections or questions or connections that you draw from the presentations?
Thanks, Patrick, and thank you to everyone who gave their beautiful talks. I actually had a question for Sonia. I think you said at the start of your talk that the multimodal transcript could be used to help criminal defendants in exposing police bias and police misconduct. Do I have that about right? I'm wondering if you could speak to any examples of that happening that you've seen or people that you've spoken to, and how that shows up in courtroom experiences.
Great question. Stuart, over to you.
Thanks. It was great. We didn't plan, but there were such resonances among the talks. It was really fantastic. I think that maybe just to respond to this question of evidence, it's like, I think it is so tied to narrative, and that is part of the reason, why police, we have this constant recourse to like this scientific nature of evidence in like popular culture, but in reality, of course, that there's not much to it when police are collecting and producing evidence. And of course, one of the I think correct but liberal critiques of the police today is how infrequently they actually solve so-called crimes. But it's in part because I think that the solving that they're doing is based on producing plausible narratives, and that is why the racial scripts, racist scripts of our society constantly recur in those narratives. It's what they have at hand. And I think this kind of goes to what Nikhil was saying of how we run into a kind of tautology or a circular logic if we just say that like police enact racism because police are racist, and the objects of police are the racially subjugated people, et cetera. It just goes in a circle if we don't actually see this, I think, as Nikhil was suggesting, as this is how race is made. This is what police are doing, is making race in this process. It's a constant constructive machinery. And and I guess just to say that, like, what I was trying to think about in relation to this funny, weird story that I just saw the other day was that we should see this as being easily transportable. It's not like it's only something that police are able to make sense of in their local jurisdiction. It's not that the LAPD are relying on their deeply embedded local knowledge of Los Angeles to affect their acts. Quite the contrary. Their ambition is to make this process be a far more than local process, and they consistently do it. And actually, just to Nikhil mentions Charles Sloane. I mean, Charles Sloane, when he basically gets told, because he's a public safety advisor, so I read about him a little bit. When he gets told he can't be overseas anymore, he flips out. He's so mad, right? And it's because it's because he thinks that, like, his job is to bring his upstate New York police expertise, his dog training expertise, to the globe. And when that project comes to an end, he sees it as the end of his identity as a cop, right? And so I think there's some kind of value in understanding the officer's own self-understanding in order to make sense of it.
Thanks, Stuart. That was great. Nikhil, I don't know if you wanted to respond to Sonia's question about the construction of evidence, which is there, I guess, in Gabriella's question too, and the question of sort of, is it possible to interrupt this logic? If as I think we can see across all four of the presentations, these are transportable tropes that cross boundaries. Can they be, transported in the other direction in a struggle against the limitlessness of the police power? I don't know if you have any reflections on that, Nikki.
I think it's such a important and such a difficult question. And, I feel like then I just become, in trying to answer it, I become less like the scholar who's trying to make sense of the history of policing and more someone in a horizontal conversation that we're all having as citizens and subjects in this moment of how do we engage the politics of policing. And I think Gabriella's presentation in many ways, although mediated through literature in this wonderful way, is speaking most closely to that question. And I don't know that I have any brilliant things to say about it or really illuminating things to say about it. I think one of the books that I've been wrestling with for years is James Forman Jr.'s Locking Up Our Own, which I think is a really, really important book, which is really engaging with, and won the Pulitzer Prize, and James Forman Jr. is the son of a very important civil rights, Black Power intellectual, James Forman Sr., and comes from a long line of people thinking about this. And, one of the things he's really engaging in that book is the question of communities that are victimized, have high rates of homicide or have high rates of violence or property crime, and the relationship to the police. And I think in the defund the police conversation, the which in some ways has been, I think, kind of defeated, at least temporarily, it seems to me. It seems like what we've wound up with after the George Floyd rebellion, after these very, very expansive demands about reimagining policing, is we're back in a conversation that's maybe not quite as punitive as it was in the first round, but it's still about how we need to strengthen police. Because of public safety, and because in fact it is Black and brown communities that are the most victimized by crime, and that's partly what Forman's book is engaging with. So I think the urgency of the questions that Gabriella is posing and that others are posing about how we think of the development of a narrative and imagination, a set of strategies around public safety that don't run through the police, is incredibly urgent. But it's extremely hard as a practical matter to do that in a way that decouples fully from the police. The police have too many resources. I mean, I find this all the time because we do this work in prison education, which I would say is completely dependent upon the carceral complex to work. We have to negotiate with them all the time. So I end up finding myself in that mid-range conversation of how do we, it's almost like kind of Sonia's recommendation, how do you sort of repurpose tactics within the terrain of the encounter, to gain to wrest something back for a more just outcome. But I'm then always find myself, troubled by that, because it doesn't, it's not just because it doesn't go to the maximalist abolitionist position, but because I know from my reading and my understanding of this, that the police are always this relentlessly absorptive project, right? And so it's like breaking from the police is as hard as imagining breaking from capitalism. There's a reason for that. They're very, or racism, they're closely aligned dimensions of how power works, and has worked for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I think that's tremendously well put. And it would be remiss of us not to mention, of course, the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic have really heightened all of this. But, communities of color, the hardest hit, the most under-resourced, the intersection between policing and public health. All of this hasn't forced a change. It hasn't interrupted the logic. It seems to have heightened it. Sonia, did you want to respond to Gabriella's question about can the sorts of discourse analysis counter the forensic power of the body cam and dash cam evidence, the transcripts, and any sort of wider reflections, since you're really engaged in analysing, as Nikhil mentioned, sort of at the tactical level.
Tactical level, yeah. Just to answer very quickly, in terms of these transcripts, and also the showing of body cams and dash cams, for most of the traffic stops that I observed, those even the criminal defendants were not viewing their own body cams and dash cam footage. They weren't being shown in court. So what we see in the high profile cases is it's not the case in most of the routine traffic stops where you're using public defenders. They don't have time. They have hundreds of caseloads. They don't have time to actually view this footage, which is very long, to find the particular moment where there might have been some abuse of power. The thing about the transcripts the reason why I put this forth as an idea, knowing full well the limitations of my proposal, is because I see there's a bias towards visual modes of presenting not just evidence, but this sort of the visualization of and sort of the racialization through visual modalities of Black and Brown and Indigenous peoples. Whereas if we're looking at the encounter itself as a moment of deep precarity in which people are afraid to move, much less speak, right? If one were to do a discourse analysis and look at the ways in which the communicative resources are getting imagined, deployed, and sort of reframed in ways that make it okay for police discretion to operate in the way it does, which is to limit the freedom or the constitutional rights that people have, then perhaps that would be a corrective. But I mean, as Nikhil said, I am also aware of the fact that this is just in some ways a way for me to reassert the importance of language and interaction and the ways in which inequality gets enacted and reproduced. But it's definitely not the be end and end all of all, solution. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sonia, for that. Just as a follow-up, to Sonia was just talking about the dominance of the visual in all this. Gabriella, do you think that and the importance of turning to quite detailed, close readings of communicative and linguistic interactions in these police stops? Gabriella, do you think there's something about the verbal medium, the use of language in the literary text you're looking at that challenges these dominant logics? I mean, do you think, say, what Morrison's doing in The Bluest Eye, does it offer us does it open up a space for a different kind of thinking, maybe, or different uses of narrative? What do you think?
Thank you for that question. My immediate thought is that the novel definitely engages with the resources of narrative that are used to propagate a story. And I argue that the way that the novel starts 3 times and continuously cycles back to beginnings instead of endpoints is a way that it's trying to disrupt a narrative common sense about crime or harms, as I like to say, the punishment and the aftermath. So I mean, I definitely obviously believe in language and literature having a deep potential to engage in this issue. And I think that Morrison's novel does so through rethinking how narratives are put together in order to construct a transparent story that could give someone in power the right to assign a punishment or a sentence.
Yeah, thank you. And I that sense that you just articulated, Gabriella, of the doubling back to the start of the story, I mean, that echoes your reflections about, you asserted, as much as it might be satisfying to have a linear narrative about the connection between the slave patrols, the frontier, and the beat of contemporary policing, we need to circle back and investigate the ways that policing was there at the origins. And Stuart, as you were saying, it's just that constitutive power. just as we have a few more minutes, I'd like to invite any of our attendees to, if you have a question, to use the Q&A feature, or you can send a chat to the host and panelists. I see that Andrew Pepper, my co-organizer, co-host, had a thought regarding Mark Fisher's claim via Zizek that, quote, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." So Andrew asks, is it also easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of the police? I mean, certainly there's a way in which we've been dealing with quite an apocalyptic imaginary, and yet, you know, the beat goes on, the patrols continue. One thing, from the vantage point of those of us who do research on, you know, war culture and the struggle for peace and nonviolent conflict resolution, I was wondering if I could ask any of the panelists. It's striking how rich and inspiring a conversation we've had. Colonialism, empire, violence has come up, but I'm wondering if anybody has any reflections about the role of the militarization of policing in all this, whether, you know, that striking, those scenes from Kabul airport where US Marines were put in the position of policing barricades as the US withdrew from Afghanistan, and those heartbreaking scenes of humanitarian disaster there at the airport, the end of the forever war era. But we've also been told that as an alternative to boots on the ground, the US is going to engage over the horizon. I think it's quite a striking metaphor for limitless elasticity, an over the horizon, seemingly permanent war on global terror, using high technology, drones, special forces, on covert missions. It seems to be at once the end of a forever war, but the continuation of forever wars. And knowing just how much military hardware is given that US taxpayers have paid for to police departments, that's why there are those MRAP tank-like vehicles in Ferguson, Missouri. Just wondering, do you think, and I know Nikhil and Stuart, you've written on this extensively, if there's a way in which arguing for demilitarization helps us get a handle on this kind of struggle to interrupt this limitless power. Just any quick reflections on, so the wars have ended, you know, where are we now? Do you see that an alternative to militarization? Anyone want to jump in on that?
Well, I mean, I think you've put it quite well that there's likely to be a continuation, maybe a slight transformation, but not an end in war making. You know, at the same time, like, you know, so I think the demand of demilitarization is, you know, necessary but insufficient. And, you know, and I think it kind of puts us in this position that we all have kind of referred to here, which is about our analysis of this, you know, the situation leading us to struggle to formulate a kind of practical and reasonable answer. And it kind of goes just to to the question of like, can we imagine, you know, a world without police, or the end of policing? You know, and I struggle with this too, because, you know, actually just yesterday, I was talking with Giomar, who has a new book on this very topic. You know, and he points out that we all the time, you know, resolve conflicts and live our lives without police. And I think this is where it's useful to make the distinction I was trying to make between, you know, police as an activity and police as an institution. I mean, when we don't get along with each other and we have a conflict among friends, you know, we can resolve it without, you know, calling uniformed guys with guns to intervene. And it points to potentially the possible positive way to recuperate the idea of the police power as a kind of protective social, you know, orientation that is collective and you know, about you know, safety of a collectivity with something in common, you know. But at the same time, I think it's also true that the police institution has kind of obliterated our understanding of any kind of you know, power of the state that isn't, you know, just marked by the guys with the badge and the gun. So I do think it's possible to imagine a world without the police institution, but that requires perhaps a new kind of investment in the older definition of the police power, which may not be not just difficult, but may not be what people actually want. So that's another problem.
Thanks, Stuart. Anyone else wanted to jump in on that one? We have we have
I'll say something.
Oh yeah, please.
I was sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know how much time we have left, but I think that you know, yesterday we've had a once again in the era that we're told is defined by polarization and you know, irreconcilable politics. Somehow our government manages year in and year out to pass hundreds of billions of dollars of military spending on a bipartisan basis with barely any dissent. And of course, we know about the 800 military bases around the world and all of this, right? And I think, you know, one of the things that we probably need to think about, and it was maybe implicit in what I was saying, that the militaristic orientation to world affairs is itself something that is an irritant, and it's not just the militarization of the police, it's the way in which the arrogation of police power by the United States in its orientation to the world is itself, in some sense, definitional to what it means to be American. You know, I think when I talk about policing sort of constituting an idea of social citizenship, you know, and I think that's also there in Stuart's story. You know, these policemen are on the streets of France, a guy bumps into his wife and it's like, I'm going to arrest you. You know, and that he is a cop, but he's also an American, and it's a particular kind of orientation, right, that is really profound. And so I always say, and this is not a phrase that trips off the tongue, which is why nobody will probably ever use it or should use it, but we've really lived through the policification of the military more than the militarization of the police. You know, the United States has been involved in ceaseless police action since World War II in the world. And the advantage of police action is precisely that thing again, that it's elastic, it's discretionary, it's defined as actually limiting violence rather than expanding violence. Police is somehow peace, right? Police is the route to peace. It's not the route to war. It's the opposite of war. But that's our imagination of what we must do to sort of keep the peace. They're peace officers, right? And this is a real problem, right? Because this is what has kind of metastasized beyond any reasonable scale and continues to. And you know, the first thing that goes anytime you have a discussion, like, I mean, it's pretty easy to think about how to manage the police problem. If you really establish serious civilian accountability over the police in American cities, I mean, you know what that would mean? I mean, it could be, I'm not saying it's a magic bullet, but you see how police fight this tooth and nail whenever it's even raised as a question. It is the one thing that cannot happen. The one limitation that is unacceptable to police is the idea that they are subject to a kind of democratic accountability. That tells you everything about the police power that you need to know.
Yeah, actually, that's a perfect lead-in. I think we've got time for one more question. We have a question in the chat from Samina Mullah, who says, I'm now working on ethnographies of civilian oversight of police in the US, which even as a reformist project falls squarely into the zone of being an extension of policing. Given the elasticity of the power of policing, and Samina notes that her conversations around this with my collaborators often lead us back to the Praetorian Guard and our sense that the police are not governable, what do you anticipate we might see in the relationship between civilian oversight of policing and property, whiteness, race, and as a new frontier of global governance? A really wonderful question. Sonia, did you, I mean, Nikhil actually anticipated and responded to that already. Sonia, did you want to respond to this, as this is, you know, right, intersects with your own research?
All right. Yeah, let me see if I can get a handle on this question. So the civilian oversight of policing, there are community boards that do collaborate with police. I'm not familiar with civilian oversight of policing, so I'm not really sure what I can say about this. Yeah, maybe I could pass it on to someone else, because unless,
Although actually, I mean, in a way, oversight, you know, just to think about metaphors of vision and sight,
I see.
exactly what's promised by. So I guess another way of asking Samina's question in relation to your work, Sonia, would be, are there other sort of modes of vision that we can imagine?
Right. I mean, so I was invited to do my research by the public defender of Richland County, and one of the things that, I mean, you know, public defenders are notoriously overworked and you know, very much trying to advocate for the criminal defendants and aware of many of these issues with policing, even though they do have relationships with police officers. Is that they were really curious to know what was happening during what was happening. You know, how could I analyze these body cams and dash cams in a way that they couldn't, right? What is it that I could see that they couldn't, in terms of the ways of different kinds of misalignment, that, you know, or we can say misunderstanding, the way that certain kinds of forms of communication are misread. But this is also, I mean, in some ways, yes, if we were to think about the encounter itself in a sort of a broader communicative field, then we could get a better sense of the forms of social action that emerge through these encounters, the misunderstandings and misalignments, and perhaps have a more nuanced understanding of the police officer's subject positions in relation to the criminal defendant and vice versa. So, I mean, I think if that's what you're getting at, yeah, I do think that the sort of thinking about communication in a multimodal way, looking at the ways in which we're the encounter itself as part of a broader communicative field, could give us more information, more insight into the precarious moments that constitute these encounters. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, as you just said there, Sonia, what is it they wanted to know? What is it that
Yeah.
I see that they couldn't see? I think that's just a brilliant way of encapsulating what we've been doing in this this roundtable, you know, taking such an urgent and highly contested, thorny subject, and I think each of you have offered different ways of seeing and approaching the subject in an enormously helpful and you know, inspiring way. So I think at this point, probably we've gone over time a bit, so we should probably draw things to a close. But I wonder if we can give our panelists and each other a virtual round of applause. Thanks so much, Sonia, Gabriella, Stuart, and Nikhil. This has been absolutely brilliant. And thank you all to our attendees for thinking along with us and listening to such a brilliant conversation. Thank you all. So I'll stop